Welcome to the Surviving Siblings podcast. I'm your host, Maya Roffler. As a surviving sibling myself, I knew that I wanted to share my story, my brother's story. I lost my brother to a homicide in November 2016, and after going through this experience, I knew that I wanted to share my story and his story. And now it's your turn to share your stories. Today I have another incredible surviving sibling with us. Her name is Laing. Laing, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited to have you here, and I'm really excited that we connected recently and talked about your book and your journey, and we're going to talk about all of it here. But I want to kick off by having you tell us a little bit about you and your sister, Jenna, obviously why we're here today, and your experience together and kind of your background and connection. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Laing?
Sure. So my sister and I grew up in New York City, and we went to an all-girls school on the Upper East Side, and we both went to school there through 8th grade, and then we actually both went to boarding school in Connecticut and ended up at the same schools, and then we both ended up at the same college as well. And so we were together a lot through the years, and I think that there probably were pros and cons of that. It was obviously really nice to have someone that you knew and trusted around all the time. And on the other hand, my mom has mentioned at different times that she wonders if that wasn't fair to my sister to sort of, since she was younger, to sort of have to always be following and not have sort of her own place to sort of carve her own path. I mean, we study different things, but we did spend a lot of time together, and our parents were divorced when I was 10 and she was 7. And so I think, when you've got something that you go through that's really hard together, you end up with a certain bond that comes from it. And then there was also probably a separation that existed as a result of that as well, in that we handled things differently, partly because of age and partly because of disposition. So I came out of that as someone who sort of liked to go straight through the middle of things, emotionally, and really sort of deal with things very upfront. And she tended to internalize them more and just process it differently. And I think that was a way in which we sort of diverged at different times in our life in particular. So, but in general, we were friendly and close, and obviously all relationships have come and go different stages of life. But she was super charming and smart and funny, and she and I shared a lot of friends in common, and so she was awesome. I miss her.
Yeah, of course. I totally understand. My brother and I were 3 years apart too. But yeah, that's interesting. I was going to ask you, what the age difference was. So that's interesting. We have that in common. Yeah. And I think that's cool. And I'm the oldest too. So it's just a different dynamic too. I think because I'm a product of divorce as well. Right. And when you're the oldest and you're seeing things and that depends on the personality type too. So, but you guys were super tied together, going to all these different schools together and kind of moving through life together. That's really interesting. Yeah, I'm sure it's interesting that your mom reflects back and goes, I wonder if that impacted her. I think that's kind of interesting. Yeah, I like talking about family dynamics because I think it's integral into the story of your grief and loss, right, too. So tell us a little bit about, going up to the loss of Jenna, because your loss with Jenna is still quite recent. It was in 2019. So tell us a little bit about your experience. Tell us a little bit about what happened and what life was like as you were moving into that loss.
Sure. So Jenna lived in Nashville. She had a daughter who was 9 at the time, and I lived in Southern California. So we both had moved away from New York, away from the East Coast. I think that was actually something that we shared in common, that we were sort of broadening, what we wanted to sort of experience. And that was something later that became something that really bonded us. But leading up to her death, I learned that she was snoring really loudly and sleeping in her own room, which I mostly learned from her daughter, but the way children just sort of chatter.
Yeah.
And because of the work that I do, I have spent, the past 20 plus years in medical devices and on the investing side. And one of the things I had most recently done was co-founded a business that makes medical devices for the treatment of obstructive sleep apnea. And snoring is the leading symptom of sleep apnea. And I also knew just from spending time with Jenna that she was taking daily naps and she was moody and all of these are some of the most common symptoms of sleep apnea. And so I encouraged her to go get tested. And I actually sent her the name of a local physician that she could, do some diagnostics with. And, I don't know why she didn't get tested, but she didn't. She claimed to have had a conversation with her primary care doctor. It's interesting, actually, in the case of sleep apnea, it does tend to be more men than women who have it. But as a percentage, women are more underdiagnosed. So doctors have it in their head that it's more men that have it, but actually many, many women do as well. And it's, it's highly correlated with, both being male, being a bit overweight, drinking. I guess maybe I should explain. Sleep apnea is a condition where the soft tissue in your throat falls back and blocks the airway when you're sleeping. And it's very dangerous because you stop getting oxygen. It forces your heart to have to work really, really hard to push around the oxygen that does have in the system. And it's highly correlated with cardiovascular disease and stroke and atrial fibrillation, and diabetes, and cancer. And so it's a serious condition and it's very common. There are about 1 billion people estimated to have it in the world, and 80% are undiagnosed. So you've got one
Whoa.
it's very,
Yeah.
very common. And people just aren't aware of it and they don't know what to look for. And so, I always like to take an opportunity to tell people what the symptoms are. So yeah, daytime sleepiness, waking up gasping, waking up with a dry mouth, and snoring. Those are and depression as well. So those are the big ones. And I would suggest to anyone, if you've got any of those symptoms, or it's often a bed partner who has them. Usually the person who has it themselves isn't that aware of it. The person who's sleeping with them and hearing it. And so to go talk to their doctor. I think the awareness of it is growing, and the ease with which people can get diagnosed has gone up a ton. And you can do a home sleep study now. It's really straightforward. And I wish my sister had. I mean,
That's what I like. You're stealing the thoughts out of my head, Laing, because there's so many things that are going through my mind. I was like, yes, tell us what sleep apnea is, because I do feel like it's talked about a lot more now than even, 5 years ago, right? Like people are aware of it. But I feel like, I think I automatically attribute it to men. I don't think about women. I don't think about women not having it. I just think we are like, our husbands or what partners were like, oh, he snores so bad. Like I got to go sleep on the couch or the other room or the guest room or something, right? And that's kind of a joke, but it's actually very serious. And so thank you for defining that for us. But what I find so fascinating too about all of this is, one, the amount of people that have it, two, the amount of people that are undiagnosed, with it. But then to go deeper and to go into your story, I find it so fascinating that you and we obviously talked prior to this podcast, but you had shared with me that you had been in the medical, arena for work, a co-founder, medical devices. You knew about all of this, and yet, bless her heart, Jenna did not actually go. That's really mind-blowing. She did not go and get tested for this. So that must be quite frustrating and also confusing for you as the sister in this, right? Having the knowledge. I'm sure that was like, a moment for you.
I've thought about it obviously a lot. And how is it that, I mean, just the irony, right? Of course, I've spent my whole, my career, I put my professional life into, we've now, at the company that I founded, it's a company called Prosomnus. We make oral devices to help people while they're sleeping. we've treated more than 250,000 people. I mean, we've been very successful. It's a public company. We, out there, we've got great clinical data, and I couldn't get her tested. But, that's actually very common. And part of why I like telling the story is people are very resistant, even when, and, maybe even more so when it's your sister, right? I mean, I always like to joke that I used up my sisterly advice back in 1988 or something. So,
I love that. Yes, guilty.
quota.
I'm a big sister. I know. Like, they don't like to listen to you, and then they're like, "Oh man, yeah,
Right.
I get
Yeah.
it."
I mean, it might have, I think that there was some element of her being like, you have a hammer. I'm not going to be your nail. Just because you're in this field does not mean that I have what you, I don't know. It's obviously unknowable at this point, but
Right.
it's, hopefully, by telling the story and having other people also realize that it's serious. There's mild, moderate, and severe sleep apnea, and someone having, she ended up with, they had to do an autopsy because it was such a shock that she died. I guess I could explain that, what happened there. But she, so hers was at sort of the tail. It was an extreme case of this, but it for sure reduces quality of life and length of life for people. And so it is worth paying attention to. But she was home. She was, she had spent the evening with her husband and daughter, and her husband took my niece up to put her to bed and came down, and she was in atrial fibrillation and on the couch. And, it wasn't clear. I think that she had fallen asleep and then just wasn't able to get her out of it. And so it's just heartbreaking because it's treatable, it's preventable. And
Right.
she's, such an amazing person. And, she was only 46. So
that was my next question for you. So so she was only 46, and this was back in 2019. And so this was just a normal evening in Nashville with the family, and she fell asleep. And so what does that look like when somebody, so we hope, God forbid, if somebody goes through this. So her daughter noticed that she was snoring and sleeping in another room and tired throughout the day. So a lot of these symptoms, she didn't get help. And then this particular evening, she fell asleep, but what does that look like when somebody goes through that? And I know that's kind of, graphic, but I do want people to be aware of this and understand. So her husband comes and finds her, and what is that like? Do they take her to the hospital? Like, what did that look like, Laing? Yeah.
Yeah. She, well, I'll back up. Another thing that what is very common when I say daytime sleepiness, her husband told me after the fact that she would fall asleep all the time. So she was so tired. Because even if you're in bed for 8 hours a night or whatever, if you have sleep apnea, you're having these micro arousals. So you're not getting into the deep REM sleep. You're not getting the quality of sleep, which is also why you then end up with, some of the, depression or moodiness or, other kinds of mental health, because as you all know, get enough sleep.
Right. We should all know that at this point, if your body's not resetting every night. Yes.
And so, so the fact that she had fallen asleep on the couch was, totally common, right? I mean, that was, I think, something that was happening pretty regularly. She'd fall asleep in a chair. She felt, just napping, sort of what the rest of us would think sort of inappropriately all the time. But I think when she came, I think that her color was off. I think that she looked very gray, and he called an ambulance, and they came. And so it was the paramedics who found her, I think initially in atrial fibrillation, and then she was technically still alive when they found her. And then she went into ventricular fibrillation, and they just couldn't stabilize it. They couldn't get her rhythm back. Often when someone's in AFib, they can.
And can you define what AFib is for those of us who don't know what that is? Can you define
sure.
that for
So
us?
atrial fibrillation it's basically an irregular heartbeat. It gets your electrical signals start getting out of whack, and you can't get the heartbeat back to a sort of sustainable, relaxed state. And so it's but because it was such a shock. I mean, yes, I knew that she snored, and yes, I was trying to get her help, but never in a million years dawned on me that she might die. I mean, like that, needless to say, if that was something I was really thinking about, I would have gotten on an airplane or, whatever. But so this was a somewhat unusual case in that regard. But, and nobody knew what was going on. Like, literally could have been anything at that point. I mean, our whole family was like, whoa, what happened? And the state, when something happens like that, where it's this sort of unexpected younger person dying, they require an autopsy, which for anyone who's gone through, what a hellish process to wait, not knowing. I mean, I think the state of Tennessee, or at least the county, I think I have to know more about the, her county's coroner's office than I ever hoped to. But, it took, I think it was 16 weeks. I mean, 16 weeks is a really long time to not know why someone had really died. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, was there something else going on? Or,
that's something I've learned on this journey too, Laing, is in my own experience and oh my God, mine was years.
Wow.
And it was insane. And there's people that have been on the show and even on this particular season where it was months to a year. Like, it's crazy. So yeah, I mean, 16 weeks, that's insane. It's insane.
And it's scary when you're, of course, I've always said, like, in a vacuum, you fill it with bad things. You don't tend to be like, oh, everything must have been great. So you're thinking, all your brain is going, all these horrible things that could have, would have, whatever. And so, it turned out they found that she had an enlarged heart. And that's very common for people who have sleep apnea because of what I was explaining before. When you don't have enough oxygen, your muscle's working that much harder, and the heart is muscle, and that in and of itself, the thickening of the heart puts you at greater risk. So, it was just so sad, just so sad.
So take us back to that night again, Laing, when that happened. So obviously they take her to the hospital, and her husband, I'm assuming her husband called you. What was that like? Because we all have that memory of the call. Like, that's my first episode in season 1 is the call. And it's so interesting because almost every single guest I have on talks about the call that they get, right? And that's kind of a big moment. Is that who called? I'm assuming that's who called you and told you what was going on. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. It's funny, actually. I was just thinking about it this week. I was at a restaurant when I got the call, and I was back at that restaurant just this week in the same room. And, it's
weird.
Just,
wow. I know we're talking about it.
And so, yeah, I was out for dinner with my husband. It was during the holidays, so early December, and we were out. It was a Saturday night, and we were out for a nice dinner, a busy restaurant. And my phone rang, and I could tell that it was a Nashville area code, but it didn't come up with a name. I just thought that's weird. And, my husband is somebody who, if he doesn't have the name pop up, he doesn't answer it for whatever reason. I'm one of those people. I do, because I'm a little bit more neurotic.
Me too. It's fine. I do the same thing. Yeah.
And so it picked it up, and needless to say, he was really upset. And I just remember standing up and being like, hang on. I need to get to a place where I can hear you. Cause I had to walk through the restaurant, through the bar part of the restaurant. And it was actually a restaurant in a hotel. So I walked out to the lobby of the hotel, and, he did. And I at first I thought it was like a car accident. I thought something maybe had happened to my niece. Like, I just, your brain is trying to put the pieces together because it didn't make any sense. I was like, what? Wait, what? Like, she died? Like, what? What? And so, yeah, I for whatever reason, I've always been the type of person who, when there's an emergency, I tend to get super, super calm and super clear. And so I went into like, okay, tactical, like, okay, what do we do? Like, how do we get our, what are the four corners of this? Like, how do we manage this? And I remember saying to the hostess of the restaurant, I was like, I need you to go get my husband, tell him it's an emergency, and to bring my bag. And he came out, and, by then I was sort of wrapping up the call with my brother-in-law, and I was sort of sitting there, and he's like, Laing, we need to go home. And I'm like, great, we need to go home. And I was obviously just shock.
Yeah.
And so yeah, my brother-in-law we had talked, and I said, would it be helpful? Have you talked to my parents? And he said, no. I said, would it be helpful if I called them? And he said it would. And so, it was late at night. I live in California, and I was, it was late-ish, it was evening here. And on the East Coast, where my parents are, as I mentioned earlier, divorced, remarried. And so it was late there. So I spent quite a few hours trying to get to them.
Nice.
It wasn't that easy to get through to them.
Of course. How can you rest after that? Right. It's like, sleep was a thing that was not my friend for a very long time after getting the call and going through all of that. And I really connect. I think a lot of the listeners, you guys obviously will connect with this too, because it's often a thing that we hear, that when we're the person that gets the call, or we're kind of in the mix of this, you kind of go, I love how you said that, in tactical mode, like you do, because it's just like, okay, like I've got to take care of this. Like, this is huge. Like, and it's interesting because different people respond in different ways, but I really connect with you on that, Laing. Like, that was my mode too. And I think that's the case for a lot of people, especially that listen to this show and that come on this show, because that was kind of your role in the loss of your sister, right? It's like, okay, like we got to figure this out. So did you guys end up going to, I'm assuming, to Nashville, or what did you guys have a celebration of life? What were next steps for you? Because that's also a big part of your story, I'm sure.
Yeah. So, so the first step was I went to New York because I wanted to make sure my parents were okay.
Sure.
And so I did that. And I was really happy to be there with them. And, I think, like great traditions, like planning services like that, they give you something to do. And so my mom in particular was very involved with that. That was very important, and really wanted to honor my sister as best we all could. But there were all these questions like, do you bury her, cremate, like things that maybe it was somebody who was older and you had a little bit of preparation and thought and discussions. But obviously, with somebody 46,
you're not typically having those conversations. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so there were some decisions to be made, there were things like that. And so then I ended up, it was also a weird coincidence. My mother-in-law had a long bout of Alzheimer's, and coincidentally had died 10 days before.
Oh, wow.
And
yeah,
I know. And she died, I think it was a couple of days before Thanksgiving. And so the family had decided, let's wait and because they wanted to have a nice service and whatever, but it was not a good week to be trying to get her friends together. People were entertaining their own families, but so they had already picked a date for her service in Minnesota. And coincidentally, so my sister's service was on Saturday in Nashville, and we flew straight from Nashville to Minnesota for my mother-in-law. So, it was,
wow.
It was a week. I got back and forth from New York to California, then to Nashville, spoken at my sister's service, which my parents had asked me if I would do. And I was happy to. That was hard. That was really hard. And she had a big story, and I think there were 500 or 600 people at her service. It was a big, it was a big, beautiful church at Nashville. And I remember beforehand having to be alone because there were so many people who came and wanted to see me and whatever. And I was like, I kept having to pull myself out. I would go like hide in the bathroom because I was like, I can't cry. Like I have to get up and talk to 500 people.
Right.
Like,
no, I get it. I totally get that.
Once the dam, this is going to be a mess. And so I had to, and I would say to a few people, I'm like, I'll talk to you after, but like, I can't right now. And so I remember sort of staring at the ceiling, trying to keep my eyes open. And so it all went, I'm really happy that I did. It was a great sort of honor to be able to tell people about her, but it was hard too. It was really hard.
That's a question that comes up a lot, Laing. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, and thank you for just being so raw and open about that, because I get this question a lot when people are watching like lives or join our support group or something very early, right? Like I'm shocked at some people who join these groups like a day after their loss or the day of their loss. I'm like, oh, you are way more advanced than I was. Like, kudos to you. But they'll ask me those questions like, what is your opinion? What do you think? Do you think I should speak? And I'm like, it's so personal. You have to decide like what's right for you. Like for me, it was right for me. I had the most to say. I wanted to do it. I wanted to write the eulogy. I wanted to speak. And it was a celebration of life. It was very different. It was not at a church. It was not, but that was important to me. So I appreciate you sharing that part of your story too, because that's a story that a lot of people like have to, go through as well, and a part of their story. And 500, 600 people, that's a lot. That's very intimidating. And it's like, you have to figure out what's right for you. And sometimes people will come back to me and say, well, you know what? I did write it, but I had someone else read it. I'm like, that's totally cool. That's totally cool. You have to decide what's right for you. But I love how you explained it, because you said it was an honor and it was beautiful for you to do that. And that's how I feel. I would have regretted it for sure if I didn't.
Wow. Yeah. And I think I was also fortunate in that I do some speaking for my work. So I had also been trained in a particular way so that I kind of knew how to like get out of my body and just, I looked at it as a job. I have a job to do. You
compartmentalized a little bit, right? And you were like,
but
it's still so hard because it's so emotional. Like nothing can prepare you for that, right? Prepare you for that. That's what
I got about 80% of the way through. And then at one point I kind of cracked and I was like, oh, no, get back. And I was able to finish and whatever, but I got back to my, to the pew and
that's when you released. Yeah.
So
yeah. No, I think that's an important part. And that's why I like to talk about these elements of the process, because everybody's story is a little bit different. So yeah, I think, it's hard. It's hard to compartmentalize that. But if you do speak for a living or part of your job, I think it can help for sure. But nothing prepares you for this, right?
Nuts. I mean, both sides of the family and just
right.
So and such really different. One, she'd been ill. My mother-in-law had, she was fairly old and, she's in her 80s and she had lived this long, beautiful life. And she, had this very slow decline. And, with Alzheimer's, I would imagine that you would end up talking about this some too. It's such a different death. I mean, it's really the grief. I don't think culturally we are well set up for that kind of grief, where my husband in particular, he grieved. His most intense grief was 3 years before she died. Like when
anticipatory. It's totally different.
When she forgot who he was. I mean, when she couldn't make that connection, that was when the big loss, right? Your mommy doesn't know who you are. Like, I mean, that's just like the most core. And yet, so by the time the service came along, the family had largely said goodbye. Right. So many, they've had years to say goodbye. And so it was just a really different, we went to 2 funerals, but they were night and day different events. And the way
I had no idea you had this other loss in such a short period of time too. So I'm so glad we're talking about this, Laing, because it is so different. And it is something we do talk about on the show. You're right. And anticipatory grief, it's interesting because it's like you described it beautifully, and like what your husband went through. He went through like initial, like his initial call when he found out, like we talked about that, like when he found out she had, this was happening, and then when she forgot who he was. And those are all those anticipatory grief losses. It's almost like, I like to always say, like, again, I'm no therapist, but I've just listened to so many of these stories and done so much of this now that like, it's like you have all the losses kind of front loaded in that type of loss, right? It's interesting, so that when the actual, you lose the physical body of the individual that you love, and especially if they've lived a long life, you're kind of like, this is really sad and I'm going to mourn this and I'm going to grieve this, but I've already grieved so much on the front end a little bit, which is totally different than the experience of like what happened with your sister and my brother, which is sudden loss, where it's like a rug has been pulled out from underneath you. I mean, I sometimes I like to say the earth has been pulled out from underneath you, because you have so many things to work through post versus, and not to say that there's not grief that happens after with anticipatory, because now they're gone. They're actually gone. But you have to deal with everything after a sudden loss. So I think this is very interesting to highlight both of these. So thanks for sharing that, because that's
Yeah.
how I see it, at least.
Yeah. No, that was very much my experience. And it, yeah, it was, but it was, and it was, there was something nice about having what was a little bit more of a celebration at hers, and to have so many people together, um and maybe to have the focus shifted a little bit. I needed, it was almost like, out of the corner, I don't know how, it was a little more oblique. Like there were people there to support us, but it wasn't quite so dead center on my sister and what I was really dealing with. It was interestingly helpful. Another thing I don't often talk about, but it's relevant to this. I had another friend who I was very close to, die the winter after. So he died, I guess, in February after my sister died. But his death was different. He had cancer that, he had treated it. It went into remission, and then it came back really in January, and he got very sick. And so I was able to go visit him a lot in January. And it was really helpful for me to be able to say goodbye to him the way that I didn't get to with my sister. It granted me the journey that I had not been given. And it was beautiful to see him and spend the time with him. But I had a parallel thing going on that I needed to as well. So I feel a particular closeness with him in that, interestingly, as well. So it was a lot of loss all at once. So,
well, you're giving me chills, like, because they do say it happens in threes, and I'm like, oh my God, whenever anybody tells me that they've just lost someone, I'm like, oh God, I never want that to be true, but it definitely was for you, and it was for me too. And it's very eerie because I had a similar experience. We're recording this at February 1st now, you guys know, but in exactly this time is when I lost a really good friend to cancer as well. So I just lost my brother in November, and then in 2016, and then February 2017, he had prostate cancer. And so similar thing. And I had a very similar experience to you. So this is very weird that you're bringing this up, and really cool. Very similar experience. And his best friend and I are still very close to this day. And it's because so both of them are quite older than me. They were actually, the friend that passed was a friend that mentored me through my career. And so this was really tragic. And he was quite young. He was actually around the same age as your sister when he passed from this. I mean, like, that's really young. And
yeah.
so same kind of experience. And it's bonded me with his best friend. Like, he's one of my best friends. He takes care of me like his little sister now. And you're right. It's like having a parallel experience though, but it can be quite healing, because you're like, okay, I didn't get to say goodbye in that type of way to my own sibling, but this particular person. And I never had anybody come on the show before and like be able to relate to that. So that's pretty cool. That's actually kind of cool. But I experienced, and then I lost a good friend a couple months after that too, and in a totally sudden way. And that kind of brought everything back up for me, right? So it's very interesting how the different types of losses affect you along this journey. So Laing, I want to get into this. So talk to us about your journey, because so that was a beautiful part of your story that you shared with us, this friend that you lost and you got to spend some time with. But like you said, you're on a parallel journey. You're moving through grief. You're going into the pandemic too. Like, this is like a lot, right? So talk us through your kind of your grief journey as the surviving sibling, and going into your first year, second year, and what was that like for you?
Yeah, the timing was a huge part of it. Both interestingly, in a good and a bad way. She died December of 19, went into lockdown March of 20. And so the downside clearly was, well, maybe let's start with the upside. The upside was everything slowed down a little bit, so the time, the ability, the space to heal, there was a little bit more of that, because everything just went. right?
Right.
Downside was that, it would typically have been a year where we spent a lot of time together as a family and, the healing. And I mean, we were so fortunate that we were able to get together for her service and have all of those people together. And that was really meaningful. And I thought so much about the families during COVID that didn't get that. And just what a double loss. That's a really hard thing, I would imagine. I was really cognizant of that. And of course, my niece who was young and wanting to, be with her, my parents who were older, worrying about them getting sick. And I just was so frightened. What if we have another loss here? That just felt unbearable. When I was worried about my parents getting sick and some of the decisions that they would sometimes make, like for instance, my niece would come stay with them because they were worried about her. But then of course I was worried, well, what if she's sick and gets you guys? And I was like, I don't know that I can handle more death right now.
That is a huge thing that you're bringing up right now, Laing. I love this. This is something that comes up a lot too, is once we go through such a significant loss like our sibling, this fear that we're going to lose who's next, next, what's going to happen next. And so you're giving me chills a little bit because this is something that I personally experienced. I know a lot of you guys listening asked me about this and want to talk about it. Like, is this normal? And thank you for normalizing this and talking about this because it is totally normal and it is a normal fear. And how did you kind of push through that, Laing? How did you kind of get to the other side of that? Because that's a natural feeling to feel through COVID anyway, right? You've got a young niece that's going to visit and your elderly parents. And you're like, wait a second here. Like, we don't know about all of this stuff yet, but there's so...
We all had the existential fear of, will we get wiped out? I mean, those early
But it's
days,
elevated going through a loss like this.
Right. I mean, it was all of it. So it was really intense. And I had a young business that I was, needing to make sure survived COVID. And that was, taking up some, brain space. And then I had my own 2 children who were teenagers who were home and, you were reading all about, teenage depression and, isolation and issues, so there were all sorts of things going on. And, honestly, falling apart just never felt like an option. It was, you got to keep everything together here. But I did need help. I was really fortunate right after my sister died, my husband, found both of us because we were both dealing with grief, a grief counselor who we were talking to, and she was phenomenal. And so I had someone to talk to. So, I'm an enormous believer in that. And then I had this desire to do something creative. I actually originally was like, well, maybe I'll make jewelry or sculpture, or I wanted to make things. I had this sort of instinct, and I had no tools and no talent. And so I was stuck at home. And so I ended up reading a book called The Artist's Way, which has been around for 25 years. Julia
It's a very well-known book. Yes.
Exactly. And I had heard about it for years. My husband had done it, sort of gone through it, 10 years prior. And I finally had the time. And, one of the main things that she suggests is that you do something she calls mourning pages, where you get up and before you do anything else, you write 3 pages every day. And I'm a little rule follower. And so I went through, it's a 12-chapter book. And 1 chapter a week, I went through the whole thing exactly as prescribed. And I'd never been a journaler or a writer. I really didn't think of myself as a writer at all. And it all of a sudden just floodgates opened. I just started writing and writing and writing. And I ended up writing what I wasn't thinking of at the time, but really was poetry. And so I ended up really just expressing a lot. I was spending a lot of time outside. I live, as I mentioned, in Southern California, a really beautiful area. And so we were walking every day out, because it was the pandemic, what streets are normally, buzzing with cars and all that. We could walk down the middle of the road. So to get to really slow down in that different way of just very, things that you would normally see rush past you, or all of a sudden, you can stop and look at them, and, you smell things and you see things and you hear things, and, those electric blue skies, where there's no pollution. And so I had a lot of nature imagery going through, and so I ended up writing a lot of nature poetry. And so that was a lot of what I did. And, after a little while, I ended up pulling it all together, and it became a book that I put out. It was published in May of last year. And
it's so exciting. Congratulations.
It's really exciting. And so I had, it's been a really cathartic kind of experience to be able to, both honor my sister and sort of honor the process of going through the grief, and then also be able to sort of talk about the things that were helpful to me, because, I'm sure a lot of your motivation for doing this is, if you have to go through something like this, the best you can come out is connecting with other people and helping other people, right?
I agree completely, Laing. And I love that about your story and what you did. So I want to go back for a second, because I think we should tag the artist way in here too, because what's interesting, I read that book a long time ago. It's been around for a long time. And for me, I was going through another difficult time in my life, and I'm a little bit different. I've always been a journaler. I was an English major in college, so that's like been my life. I've been journaling since I was like 6 years old, and I have all my journals, which is a fun fact if you guys didn't know that. I have all my journals. So, like, it's really crazy. But I've been an avid journaler, and what was interesting for me is when I went through a couple dark times in my life, I stopped. And that was horrible for me, because it's such an outlet for me. And that's why, like you said, this is a great outlet for me. And talking is a great outlet for me. But I have always been a journaler. And so I noticed that pattern. And that pattern happened in my 20s when I was going through a difficult time. And that's when I read The Artist's Way and started with the 3 pages again. And then I was off to the races. So I really connect with that part of your story too. And it's a great book to kind of jumpstart you if that's something you're wanting to do. Because anybody can do 3 pages. Anybody can do 3 pages in the morning. Like, you can do it. It makes it start to seem like achievable to write or whatever. But I think in your story, what's so beautiful too is that it's a great message for all of you guys listening, because sometimes I have people that come to me and they're like, oh God, I wish I would have started this podcast, or I wish I would have done, like, written a book like some of the people that come on the show, right? Or I wish I would have done. And I think what we need to understand is that we all grieve differently. We all grieve on a different timeline, and we all have our own outlets. And what I really love about your story, Laing, is that you were like, I really need to get this out of me creatively and, like, put it out there, but I'm not really sure what that looks like because I don't feel like I'm creative. Well, you are creative, right? You were like, I have no talent. Well, you clearly do. You published a book, right? So it's in us. And if you I feel like one of your messages here is, if you feel it in you, like, that's there, right? Like, it's going to come out. And so exploring that is worth it. And I think we can't just pigeonhole ourselves into, like, one form of expression of grief. Like, I think it's going to be different for everybody.
Yeah. Interesting. I just this week heard a talk. There's an organization called the Foundation of Art and Healing, or the Foundation for Art and Healing. And one of the big premises is, if there are a few things, in art, you are making something, and typically when you're making something, you get into a flow state, which I think we all know that that's a helpful place to be. It's very calming and allows you to sort of remove yourself from, sort of the here and now emotions and reactions. But then also when you're making something, then you end up with what, he was calling an artifact. So you have a thing, and that thing becomes, often it is expressing something that you might have a hard time just describing to someone else or saying out loud or whatever. So you've got that piece, but it's also a thing that then you can go share with other people and allow for that connection. And then that connection, feeds you and helps with the healing. And I found, the talk by the fellow who was doing it to be, he was the founder of his organization, to be, it was so much the process that I found in grieving that it was just interesting. He's a professor at the Harvard School of Public Health. I mean, he's at it from a very sort of scientific, data driven perspective. But I had empirically ended up at a very similar place, and I think that the creative process of taking something that all this emotion in you, and to be able to take it out, roll it around, pull it apart, and then make something and have it be generative and positive and a reflection into the world. I mean, even if the art itself is dark, it's positive in that it's new and it's out there. And so I do think it's really, it was unlike anything that I had known before. It was something, probably 50 years old when I learned it. So hopefully.
That's cool, though. I love that part of your story.
Really are.
Yeah. And I can understand why you would have connected with that conversation and with that particular individual in that organization, because I think that, him coming from that kind of background, but then talking about like, what a cool kind of, contrast, he's talking about things that are creative. I think that's really awesome. But yeah, I think it's something that, again, I just really love and connect with your story, because whatever you're kind of feeling and whatever you're being drawn towards, I think that's amazing. Tell us, show us your book too. And if you guys are just listening, you can see in the show notes, we'll have it linked. So yes. So tell us the name of your book, of course.
It's called Mourning Leaves, and the subtitle is Reflections on Loss, Grief, and Connection. It's all art and poetry. There's probably about close to 80 original paintings that were done. I worked with an artist named Kelly Lee Radding, who is a fine art painter, and she was an amazing collaborator. And so we worked through all of the art together, which, sort of another layer of doing something creative. And, it tells, the introduction tells a little bit of the story that I was telling this morning about what happened with Jenna. And then the process that I found helpful to get through healing. It's a gift book. It's really for people, either for themselves as they work through it, but it's quite beautiful, and so it's nice as something to give to somebody, in lieu of flowers, or or with a sympathy card, that sort of thing. I'm finding that's a lot of how people are using it, and it's been interesting to have a book like this, because I approach it in one particular way. Like, I tend to sit down and read it, front to back, but I get lots of comments from people that they're using it more as a meditation, that they'll leave it next to their bed and read one of the poems, in the morning when they wake up or before they go to bed. And so it's fun to have it have its own life. And
yeah,
people sort of are incorporating it into their own, grief and life. And so but I guess just one last thing on the, the subtitle. I learned all these things that I didn't know before. So the subtitle is really telling the reader what it's about, right? So Mourning Leaves, there's a lot of sort of double entendre in that, right? There's a mourning. This is mourning like the time of day, but of course there's the other mourning, leaves. They're all botanical poems, so it's sort of the botanicals, and then there's the leaving, the verb, and then also with Julia Cameron's Mourning Pages, like the leaves of a book. So there's a lot of meaning in the Mourning Leaves title itself, but the reflections on loss, grief, and connection, the loss and grief are fairly straightforward, but the connection for me was really the silver lining of all of this, the opportunity to meet people like you and, so many people, and hear different stories and connect with people that I otherwise really wouldn't have. And so, I think it's sort of the most hopeful piece of this is that actually out of loss, a different door opens for relationships and experiences that we wouldn't otherwise have had. And so, so I try to, I think that the book, some people worry that the book might be really sort of sad, or like it's not a sad book. It's really much more sort of about sort of hope and healing and beauty, and our own resilience in terms of getting through.
I love that. Yeah, I love that. When we first connected, you were sharing some of that with me. And I think one of the takeaways that I get from this beautiful book that and I have a question too about the kind of the process in a second, but I want to point this out because I have a lot of authors to come on the show or connect, or, like you said, these are not people that I ever probably would have met in my life. And I think, sometimes people have different opinions about, do you have to find a silver lining in grief? That's up to you. I think that's your journey, right? For me, I had to. Like I had to. And I feel lucky enough that these gifts just came to me, right? Also just by doing the connection and reaching out there and putting my work out there, just like it's happened for you, Laing. And for me, I do have to have a silver lining to it, because then what was the point, right? I mean, what was the point? And meeting people like you and all the amazing people that come on the show, all of you guys who listen, like it's some of the best people I've ever met in my entire life. And I love that you have connection in the title, because it's some of the deepest connections I've ever had in my life, because nobody else understands what I've been through other than strangers that I've never even met in person, which is crazy. And I feel so bonded to you guys. So I love that you brought that up. And I think there's another part of this too, when we were talking prior, that, again, I've had incredible authors on, some of my favorite books I've ever read now, but I do find sometimes this is interesting, because as I would recommend books or have people on, especially early, like in the first year or two, it can be quite hard. And it was for me. It took me like 4 or 5 years to really read a true sibling loss book. And that's because that was part of my journey. And year 5 is when I started to think about this show and like start to create it. And then I came to the mic, like I always say on the show. But that seemed like climbing Mount Everest, almost like reading a full book, even like 100-page or 150. So I think that's really what's beautiful about your book, is that if you're not ready for that, you can bite off a little piece, or you can meditate with a little piece, and whatever sits with you, that's cool. And if you're not ready to read something again, put it down, come back to it in a week, come back to it in a month, or whenever you want to, but it's not so much to digest at that time. And so I really love the idea of having your book, because we had also talked about, flowers are great, but they die. And it's almost like you are watching the death process again, right? And I love flowers. You guys can always send me flowers. I love them. But, it's an interesting thing, and an interesting thing to look at, the connection between life and death when you're going through it. And so what a beautiful thing to give to someone that can digest at their own speed and process and use it in their own way. So I just wanted to point that out, because I really loved that part of our conversation when we first connected, because it can feel a little bit big to read a full book, right? In the beginning.
I mean, I was given stacks and stacks of books, and I think, like I told you before, I'd read a paragraph and I'm like, I can't remember. I don't know what that said. And then I'd go back and I'd read it again. And I'm like, I have no idea what that just, and I just I wasn't in a place where I could read. And so, I barely read any of those books. And so, yeah, I mean, one of the things about this book, it has so much art that even if you're not up for reading, it has just beautiful imagery. And I think nature is so restorative.
That's what I love about this too. How did you connect with the artist real quick? I just want to make sure we have that on here too, because I think that's interesting.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, I was such a novice. Where does one find a botanical artist? I mean, it was the poems so clearly begged for paint, art of some sort. And so I figured out sort of the style that I wanted. And I was like, where do you find a botanical? So what do? You Google it. So I Googled, botanical artists, and lo and behold, there's an American Society of Botanical Artists, and I don't know, 500 members or something like that. And they all have little thumbnails of their work. And I went through all of them, and Kelly's work was my top choice. And what I liked about
it spoke to you. Like you saw it and you were just like, yeah.
And what I really liked about her work was not only did it have, beautiful flowers, plants, and but she also had, the roots and the thorns and the drying leaves and the decay. And my text required somebody who got all of that, not just making it pretty, but, even on the cover, you might not notice it, but there's a lemon, but there's also the thorn on the lemon. And it's the beauty, and it's the sharp edges, and it's, it's all of that. And how we all navigate all of what makes life beautiful and rich. Right. So, so I just reached out to her. I said, have you ever illustrated a book? She said, I have, and sent her the manuscript, and she came back and said, this is what I want to do. And, it's now been 2.5 years, and we talked, or communicated nearly every day, and never had a cross word. And she's just been an incredible partner in all of this, and just the talent that she has. It's just incredible.
I mean, it's beautiful. And, again, another part of your subtitle, connection. You never would have probably ever encountered her in your life had you not embarked on this journey. So it's a beautiful thing. And I wanted to touch on that, but really cool because I connect with that. That's how I've connected with a lot of the people that have come on this show, is just like going down these rabbit holes and connecting. It's really cool. It's actually a really cool aspect.
No, it's really special. It's really nice. So,
well, Laing, tell us a little bit. Is there anything else that you would kind of share with us that maybe we didn't touch on before we close out today? Any pieces of advice? I mean, again, it's such an interesting part of your story with Jenna that you were in this field, in the medical device field, and had the knowledge. But any piece of advice that you would give from that perspective, kind of twofold, like if people are experiencing this and they would, like to help someone, or what are the signs? And then also on the other side, the second part of it as well, if we missed anything today, any advice you would go back and kind of give yourself on your grief journey?
Sure. So first and foremost, on the sleep apnea side, on my website, which is my first and last name, langrickers.com, I have a whole page on resources for sleep apnea. So if, you can always call your own doctor, your general practitioner, and ask about it. But if you don't feel like they're very well informed or getting the information that you want, there's a lot of information online. And there's a way to contact me on my website if somebody's really not going down a path that they're comfortable with. I'd be happy. I on a very regular basis help connect patients and doctors or people with questions. So that's
awesome.
That's a standing offer. But talk to your doctor. That's always the best thing to do. The thing, I guess, just sort of shorthand, what really worked for me was something that I've come to think of as talk it, walk it, write it. And it had, I used it in my Greek journey, but I've now used it also when other hard things happened in my life. I think, talk it. I was fortunate enough to have a really great, professional counselor who I could talk to, but I think just somebody who will listen, somebody who really take the time to let you articulate and digest what you've been through is helpful. And then the walk it, I think this stuff is so physical, it's so energetically draining to be able to, walk, get to the gym, whatever one's, exercises, but to get it out of your body is really important. I think that trapped in your body does a lot of terrible things that stress do to our bodies. And so we want to stay healthy ourselves. And then the final, write it. In my case, it was writing, but I think anything creative, it could be dance or music or painting or whatever. I think those three things are really the key to staying healthy when you're going through something stressful. And so, that's at least what's worked for me. Everyone, as you say, everyone's journey is different, but
yeah. Everyone's journey is different, but when you shared that with me, the talk it, walk it, write it, I just loved that. So I love that we're kind of ending on that note and that can look however that looks, right? Like you said, I love that. Like for you and me both, therapy was integral. Like I'm such an extrovert, but I wasn't going to like support groups or things. Like I needed my therapist. That was my outlet. And so talk it, walk it, like write it. I relate to that. And for me, exercise was really important to me as well. Running was an outlet for me, and that was huge. Everyone has their own thing, but it can be dancing, it can be fun, it can be TikTok dances, like whatever works for you. Yep. Physically, we trap this stuff. So I just loved this. And then the write it, I love that you say that too. It's like we spoke about earlier in the episode, whatever that means to you about actually expressing it and getting it out. And I think that's just, that's your quote, Laing. So Laing, tell us where we can find you. Obviously, we'll put your website on here. You already talked about that, but if you could repeat that again, and any social aspects to social media that you are on. Yeah.
Yeah. So all of the socials are also on my website, which is langrickers.com. And then on Facebook, it's author Laing Rickers. I have a Instagram, which is actually where I'm probably most active, which is mourning_leaves_and_poetry. And then I'm also on LinkedIn, which has more information about, call it my day job, my more professional medical device information, and happy to connect with any of your listeners. So it's nice to be a part of this community.
We're so happy to have you on the episode. This was beautiful. Thank you, Laing. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for writing the book. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for listening to the Surviving Siblings podcast. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did creating it for you, then share it on your chosen social media platform. And don't forget to tag us at Surviving Siblings Podcast so that more surviving siblings can find us. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. And don't forget to follow us on all social media platforms. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Surviving Siblings Podcast. All links can be found in the show notes, so be sure to check those out too. Thank you again for the support. Until the next episode, keep on surviving, my surviving siblings.